Es muy interesante el tema de las voces en la cabeza. Varios investigadores han descubierto, confirmando lo que digo, que esas voces, la gran mayoría de las veces, no son producto de la imaginación ni de enfermedades mentales, sino que son entidades inteligentes procedentes de otras dimensiones, de otro lugar del cual el ser humano normal y corriente no comprende, entidades parasitarias que utilizan el acoso para el debilitamiento del humano, del afectado, alimentarse de la energía emocional y física de sus víctimas. En la entrevista que le hicimos al reconocido psicólogo estadounidense Jerry Marcinski sobre el inquietante tema de las voces en la cabeza de gente afectada en todo el planeta, nos explicó qué decían las voces cuando eran descubiertas. Cuando alguien como Marcinski descubría que no eran imaginaciones del afectado, sino entidades inteligentes que inducían a quien las escucha a realizar actos fuera de su control, que cuando no lo hacían era acosado constantemente con ideas destructivas, autodestructivas, con visiones aterrorizantes, con pensamientos denigrantes. Las voces les insultan, les meten pensamientos repetitivos en bucle de asuntos sin importancia pero muy agotadores. No se pueden concentrar en nada importante, no pueden hacer vida normal. Y también nos explicó por qué son elegidos dichos afectados por las voces, por las entidades que los acosan. Cuando descubren esto, los investigadores, las entidades los atacan, los acosan a los investigadores. Pero veamos ahora qué nos dijo en esta interesante entrevista.
What the voices were telling these patients, you know? And I'm like, you could see that there was a correlation between when they listened to these voices, that they would get into trouble. They would get into fights, they would get into arguments, they would get paranoid. So it was clear that there was a link between their maladaptive behavior and listening to the voices. But none of the staff were interested in what the voices were telling these patients. They weren't even curious about it. What I started doing was started asking the schizophrenics on my caseload what the voices were telling them. They didn't like that because there is no benefit to them telling somebody who's working for psych or a counselor or the psychiatrist that they're hearing voices, because all the psychiatrists would do would increase their medication. So one of my jobs working in the psychiatric units was to watch the population in that particular unit, and if any of the schizophrenics started getting out of control, was to turn them into psychiatry, who would either increase their meds or add more drugs or change the drugs. It was always around drugs. They didn't spend any time talking to these people other than, what are the voices doing? Are you hearing hallucinations? So there was no benefit to them telling anybody about the voices. If they tell their friends left them, they got scared, you're possessed, something's really wrong with you, you're really strange, and the friends would leave. If they tell their parents would drag them into the psychiatrist's office. The psychiatrist would say, well, you got schizophrenia, it's incurable, you got to take these meds for the rest of your life. And then they put them on these awful meds that made them feel awful, like zombies. So there, and in the hospital, if they told a nurse or a psych or a counselor that they were hearing voices and having trouble controlling them, they ended up in front of the psychiatrist again, and their medications were again boosted up until they were drooling. Until they were walking zombies. And none of them wanted to feel that way. So they were very hesitant to tell me anything about their voices. So I would get little bits here and there. Some of them would see that I was very curious about what the voices were, and they'd tell me one little thing, and another one would tell me another little thing about the voices. And I'd start collecting this little collection of things I knew about the voices. And the more I knew about them, the easier it was to get them to talk to them, because I could approach a new guy on the ward and say, tell me what these voices are telling you. This is what I know. I know they're negative. I know they're anti-religious. All the things I knew about them. And they would see that I was different from the other psychs that would just go, well, they're hallucinations. That I was serious about wanting to know what these things were and what they were telling them. So little by little, I got piece by piece by piece, and the more I learned, the more I could tell them, till I got to the point where I knew more about their voices than some of them did. Okay, and then they would open up, and they would see that I wouldn't turn them into psychiatry unless they were dangerous. So they would give me more information. But one of them got upset when I was asking him about his voices, and he went and told the psychiatrist. The next morning, I was called into the psychiatrist's office, and the psychiatrist was scolding me, saying, "You will not ask these patients about their voices anymore. They're hallucinations. They're not real. And when you ask them about these voices, all you're doing is reinforcing their hallucinations." And he threatened me. That happened twice.
Okay.
So they didn't want anybody investigating what the voices were. So there was like an unwritten law in the psych hospital that staff don't do anything to upset psychotic patients that they don't have to do. If you were asking questions that wasn't necessary, they don't want to risk upsetting them because psychiatrists are getting beat up by them. So I think they were afraid of them. They didn't want anybody upsetting them. Okay? So I had to be very careful because that happened twice. There were two psychiatrists told me, don't be asking them questions. You're upsetting them. And they did get a little bit upset. So I had to really back down and fly under the, keep a low profile. I didn't stop asking them questions, but I had to be very careful not to upset them so they didn't go running to a psychiatrist again, and then I'd get in trouble and they'd write me up. I'd be in trouble with the institution. So one of the things I noticed is in asking them questions was that the voices were consistently negative. They were always telling them bad things. They were mocking them. They were making fun of them. It was always negative, constantly negative. They didn't say anything good whatsoever. It was all bad. So I'm kind of wondering, like, the psychiatrist would say they are hallucinations. That's what they're teaching in medical school. That's what they taught me in graduate school, that the voices are hallucinations, right? But if they're consistently negative, well, why aren't they random like all other hallucinations? I mean, hallucinations are all over the place. They're positive, they're negative, they don't make any sense. There's no pattern to them. You can't predict them. These voices were consistently negative. They were always negative. And if they said anything positive, it was only to sneak around behind the patient and stab him in the back later. It was always negative. So my question was, why aren't these voices, if they're hallucinations, like the psychiatric mafia says they are, why aren't they random also? Why is it running a consistent, predictable pattern that they're always negative? What holds them on a negative trajectory? How come they aren't random? So that was the first pattern I discovered, and kind of went, okay, if these things are running patterns, they can't be hallucinations. So I started looking for other patterns. And so the second oddity that came up is I had a patient once come into my office and we were talking about his voices. He said, when I read the 23rd Psalm, he said, the voices react like worms thrown on a hot frying pan. I found that interesting. So what I did is I got the 23rd Psalm and I started handing it out to my other patients who were hearing voices. And I said, every time you hear the voices, repeat this Psalm and come back to me in a week and tell me what happened. The voices absolutely hated it. They got louder, they got angry, they started screaming, they started gnashing. They absolutely hated it. So I went, that's odd. Why would a hallucination hate the 23rd Psalm?
Llegó un momento, según he visto en el libro, que tú hablabas, Jerry, directamente con las voces, y mentalmente también, telepáticamente, sin que tuvieras que hablar directamente con el paciente, ¿no? Y te respondían.
They did at one time, and that was years later. I'll tell you the story later, but they warned me. They were warning me to back off. They told me, you have no right to interfere with our way of life. But that was years after the state hospital when I was working at the state prison.